All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kyle McAvoy, and I'm a third-year PhD student at UCLA in the Department of Statistics and Data Science. And I'm here to talk about perturbed parameter ensembles and precipitation quantile uncertainty. So I worked on project 3 with the project mentors on the top row of this slide and the 2 REU students on the bottom row. And in this project, we were working with the CSM2 CAM6 Earth system model that many of you are probably familiar with, that was forced with prescribed sea surface temperatures. And the model was run for 3-year simulations. So what is a perturbed parameter ensemble, a PPE? So there's a lot of uncertainty in the physical parameterizations that go into climate models. So PPEs include a set of climate models that are run with a sampling of these parameters. And they're useful for model tuning and understanding the impact of the parameters on the simulated climate model output. The particular PPE sample we worked with included 45 atmospheric physics parameters, and a Latin hypercube sampling of those parameter values was used to ensure that they evenly covered the parameter space. And a total of 262 parameter combinations made up the sample that we used. In my work, I worked with monthly precipitation data, and I focused on the 0.9 quantile, since larger quantiles are related to extreme precipitation values that might be more societally relevant. So there's some data challenges with working with this data set. So precipitation has a heavy right tail. It means more extreme values are more likely. And 36 months isn't very long when you're dealing with autocorrelated data with a lot of seasonality. And finally, there were only 262 PPE samples, but in a 45-dimensional space, that can be kind of sparse. So we know that over short time spans that there's a lot of variability in the observed precipitation extremes. So we were concerned that the PPE output might not be significantly different from a sampling of internal variability in a model that was run with a single set of parameters. So the key question we had was, do short runs of a PPE demonstrate parametric uncertainty in precipitation quantiles that exceeds the normal internal variability you would get from running a model with a single set of parameter values? And the way we're going to do that is by comparing the PPE to a 10-member AMIP ensemble that is an initial condition ensemble. Before we could do that, though, we had to first take a subsample of that PPE, because some of the PPE members are wildly unrealistic. They have really large outlier values. The climates they simulate just aren't realistic. So it would kind of skew the comparison if we included them in our work. So we used observational data to find a 10-member subset of the PPE that had more realistic global climate outputs. And we used that 10-member subset to compare with the AMIP ensemble. And we're calling that subset the constrained PPE. So once we did that, at the grid box level, we took the 0.9 sample quantile of monthly precipitation for every ensemble member. And then we computed ensemble means for both that PPE ensemble and the AMIP ensemble, and took a difference subtracting the AMIP ensemble mean from the PPE ensemble mean. So what I have plotted here is that ensemble mean difference. And you can see that there are some pretty significant differences in the signal contained in these two ensembles. Over the maritime continent, you have large increases in the PPE, as well as some bands in the tropical oceans. But you also have decreases over other parts of the ocean around Southern Asia and in the Pacific. So they do seem to represent different signals of the climate. But we were really more interested in the variability that were spanned by these two ensembles. So in addition to that mean, we also took a cross-ensemble standard deviation for both the PPE ensemble and the AMIP ensemble at the grid box level. And then we calculated the ratio of the PPE ensemble standard deviation divided by the AMIP ensemble standard deviation. So that's what I have plotted here. And you can see the yellow grid boxes are the ones where the PPE ensemble had at least 5 times the standard deviation that the AMIP ensemble did. And so you can see that the PPE does span quite a bit more variability in the climate output than you would get from a single model initial condition. So next we changed focus to the global time series, the global mean time series of convective precipitation. So just a 36-month time series. And the question was whether or not we could predict the 0.9 quantile of this global mean time series as a function of the parameters. So in this work, I'm focusing specifically on convective precipitation, but the model also worked well for large scale precipitation. But I did an 80-20 train test split on the ensemble members. and then fit a fully connected neural network with the mean quantile loss function set at the quantile 0.9. And on the right, you have the results on the test set. So on the y-axis are the predicted values, and on the x-axis are the observed 0.9 quantiles for the global mean of these ensemble members. And you can see based on the quantile loss and the MSE of the quantile predictions, it seems that the model's doing a pretty good job. And there's a pretty high correlation between the predictions and the actual ones as well. So I think the model is doing a pretty good job of estimating these global quantiles as a function of parameters. Okay, so in conclusion, despite the limited time lengths of the PPE explores more climate variability than the internal variability found in just an initial condition ensemble. So therefore, even at these short time lengths, PPEs can be used to understand and tune parameter choices in climate models. And some next steps for this work would be to continue to tune the neural network and also fit a model to zonally average or even higher resolution precipitation data. Thank you. And now Nicolene is going to talk next.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Nicolene, and I'm an undergrad at Columbia majoring in physics. And so what I use the Perturb Physics Ensemble for is regional analysis of precipitation output. And so to the right, you see the 5 areas that I chose to look at. And I chose these areas because of their different precipitation patterns, and because I expected some of the areas to potentially have less observational data and therefore some interesting results. And the approximate size of these grid boxes I'm looking at were 1,000 times 1,000 kilometers. And so in order to learn more about the precipitation output, I tried to look into these 3 questions. So what PPE members have precipitation outputs that are close to the reanalysis mean? Are the parameter values for those PPE members different than the CAM6 default values? And how well can precipitation for these areas be predicted with a linear regression model and a simple neural network? And so firstly, the 2 variables I was looking at in the CAM6 were the convective precipitation and the large-scale precipitation that together give the total precipitation. And the reanalysis model I used for comparison was the ERA5 model, where I looked at the monthly average total precipitation measured in millimeters per day. And in order to compare and cross these different ensemble members, I took the mean over time, latitude and longitude for the 5 areas in the global. So I ended up with a graph like this for all of the areas, where we have the ensemble members on the x-axis and then the total precipitation output on the y-axis. And so to answer the first questions, what PPE members produce a precipitation output close to the reanalysis mean? I created these graphs for all of the areas plus the global outputs, where we have the ensemble members on the x-axis and again the total precipitation on the y-axis. The orange line is the reanalysis mean for the total precipitation, and then all the orange dots are the ensemble members that produce precipitation outputs close to this reanalysis mean. And in all of these plots, I've also highlighted the CAM6 default parameter values. That's the yellow dot thing you can see. And interestingly, for some of these areas, the default values produced precipitation outputs that were farther away than 1.5 standard deviation from the mean. And also interestingly, out of the 262 ensemble members we had, only 7 produced precipitation outputs that were within these 1.5 standard deviations for all areas. And so the next thing was for these 7 ensemble members to look at how their parameter values related to the CAM6 default values. And so in this graph, you have the parameter values of those 7 ensemble members minus the default parameter values. And interestingly, out of the 45 parameters, 9 exclusively had values that were larger than the default parameter values. And out of these 9 parameters, 6 were within the microphysics category, 2 within turbulence, and 1 within aerosol. And so lastly, I tried to create a linear regression model and a neural network with the parameter values to predict precipitation outputs. And you can see what I found for the different areas down here. And so you can see the mean squared error for the test data set. And generally, the linear regression model did better than the neural network. And for some reason, both didn't do too well on the Pacific square, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. So in conclusion, 7 out of the 262 ensemble members have precipitation outputs close to the reanalysis mean for all the study areas, plus the global output. And for the 7 ensemble members, 9 of the parameter values are exclusively larger than the CAM6 default values, and 4 are exclusively smaller. And then lastly, the linear regression model and the neural network performed well in terms of predicting the total precipitation for most of the areas, except for the Pacific. And so very quickly, personal takeaways. I didn't know how to code at all before this summer, so all the coding I've learned, it was a really big takeaway. All the knowledge about climate data science, research communication, and then getting to know some really awesome and curious people who have similar interests. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hey, how are you? My name is Anthony Guzman. I am a rising senior at the University of Southern California. Go Trojans. And today I'll be presenting my presentation on studying the Indian monsoon through perturbed parameter ensembles. So to clarify what a monsoon is, it is basically just a seasonal shift in the winds. A lot of people have this misconception that it's always associated with heavy precipitation, and that is the case for summer monsoons, which is the focus of this project, but just be aware that there are such things as winter monsoons, which are associated with severe drought. And the reason why I wanted to kind of focus on this is because a large portion of India is highly dependent on the monsoon, so much so that it is considered the real finance minister of India, just because of how prevalent and how important it is to the economy. And so the goal of this project was to use the model and the data that we collected to further understand the mechanisms of monsoons and what we can extrapolate from that. So how I ended up going about this was I kind of restricted myself to this rough area of study right here that you can see. And I took the average precipitation value of this entire region and did that over the time series. And I did that for each ensemble member. So each line that you see right there is a different ensemble. From there, for each run of the simulation, I took the maximum value of the precipitation and I fed that into a multiple linear regression network model. And I plotted that against the 45 parameters in order to see, is there any dramatic relationships between how we change the parameter and how much precipitation we get in our simulation. All you need to know from this heat map is the more vibrant these colors are, the more dramatic the relationship between changing the parameter and how much precipitation you can get. So you can kind of see I've highlighted CAPE LMT, DMPDZ, and TEACT_add as the parameters of interest. But before we move on and I explain those, I do want to mention that I divided total precipitation into convective precipitation and large-scale precipitation. If you don't know what the difference is, basically one is associated with thunderstorms and one is not. And if you want to learn more about that, I could send you the papers, but please, I beg you, don't be Nico and stay up until 5 in the morning trying to figure out the difference between the two. It's not. Let's just say she saw the sunrise that morning. But yeah. So what are these parameters and what do they do? So the first one, TEACT_add, basically just controls the initial convective parcel temperature perturbation. Oh my God, that's so many words. What does that mean? Kind of think of a lava lamp as your classical example for convection. And when you turn on that lava lamp, the waxy bubbles at the bottom kind of heat up and that drives the motion of the lava lamp. That's kind of what we're doing within our simulation at the beginning. And that's how what we're controlling through this parameter. CAPE LMT, CAPE stands for convective available potential energy. And I know that sounds complicated, but you can kind of just think of it as fuel for your car. We need gasoline to drive our cars in much the same way that we need CAPE in order to drive the convection processes within the atmosphere. So what CAPE LMT actually does, it sets the minimum amount of CAPE that you need in order to initiate that convection process within your simulation. And our last one, DMPDZ, you're gonna love this one. Air parcel fractional mass entrainment rate. Oh my God. So you just kind of have to imagine a sort of balloon, and this balloon has holes on the surface so that the inside air can actually mix with the outside air. That's kind of what's going on with our air particles in our simulation. They're not isolated from the outside environment. They're actually mixing within the environment, and that affects the temperature, the humidity, the buoyancy, which is what's really important within this. And basically, these are the three parameters that are kind of driving the convection process. And that's kind of makes sense since that's kind of what a monsoon is. It's just really fancy convection that gives you lots of water. So next steps, I really wanted to compare my model observations to real world observations. Unfortunately, some mishaps were going, so I wasn't able to do that, but I definitely do want to do that in the future. And also I was interested in using machine learning to get more data without having to use the very fancy model that we were using because it is so expensive. So I would like to have more than 3 years of data to work with. Personal takeaways, I learned how to use X-ray. I definitely learned how to read scientific papers and actually understand them. Still a little bit hard, but I'm getting the hang of it. Stats concepts, and then how to ask questions. I feel like coming here to New York City for the first time, I kind of learned how to be loud and use my own voice. So yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, thanks for listening to us.
So I had a question about comparing the PP ensemble variables to the defaults used in like the other climate model. Like, was the goal of that to see whether the defaults are like not physically realistic, or like I understood the thing about attributing which parameters are the most relevant for like the monsoons and stuff. But for like the neural networks, is there a similar like attribution of the reason we're trying to fit this is to then see which parameters are actually relevant for extreme precipitation? I was just hoping to understand the motivation of some of that better. Well, it's I guess two questions, like one about the neural network and one about comparing it to the default values. Like, what are the aims of those?
Okay, yeah. So for the neural network, it would be like these models are expensive. And so I mentioned earlier, we only have 262 samples from this PPE. It'd be great if we could have 1 million samples really densely sampling this space and get like this really rich climate output with long simulations that would tell us like, are these realistic simulations? But we just don't have that. We're never going to have the computational resources to have that. So the idea was to fit a simple model that would allow us to predict based on parameter inputs what the certain output would look like. And if that output was really, really unrealistic, maybe we could rule out those parameter choices as being viable choices for using in models going further into the future. Yeah. Yes.
Question about
Or the second question, was that more for Nico?
yes.
Yeah, so the point of like comparing the outputs of all the ensemble members that were not the default values with the one with the default values was to see if the default values would perform better for some areas than others, and they did. And so I don't know if you can really conclude, okay, so it is overall better in some areas than others, but at least for like total precipitation, it performed like significantly better for some of these grid boxes than others.
We'll take one more question.
This might also be a question for you, Nico. So you narrowed down like 7 potential out of like the 262 member ensemble, and you might have I might have just understood that like different of those 7 like did better in different regions. Were there any similarities? How similar were those 7 is what I'm getting at.
I mean, that's a good question. So basically, those 7 like fit within 1 point standard deviation for all the areas, right? So they predicted pretty good precipitation outputs. And then in the end, when you saw like the graphs with the parameter values and the differences, yeah, as I said, for some of the parameters, it seemed like they were, for all of them, exclusively larger than the default values, and for some exclusively smaller, but also for some of the parameters, they were a little more varied, which is kind of what you can see with the different colors on the.
Thanks.
Yeah, there you go.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.